The secret of the Korean miracle. How can we apply the Korean miracle to us? I will tell you the secret right now. Please subscribe and like. Pohang Steel Company, Posco, the cornerstone of Korea's economic development. President Park Chung-hee dreamed of building a steel mill in Korea, which was left in ruins by the Korean War. When you enter Yongbol-Bay along the East Sea, you can see long chimneys at the point where it meets the Hyeongsan River. This is Posco, Korea's first integrated steel mill. Since its start in 1973, Posco Pohang Iron and Steel Company has recorded sales of $100 billion and net profit of $5 billion in just a quarter of a century. We look back on the myth of Posco, which has made history in a barren wasteland with an empty field, expanding its production capacity by nearly 1 million tons a year for 40 years. Just 50 years ago, this place was all sand. On both sides of the Hyeongsan River, there were reed fields and swamps, so it was not expected that a steel mill would be built here in the future. In fact, it was a time when even the term blast furnace was only heard of. Building a steel mill here was literally impossible. On November 12, 1968, a helicopter appeared in the sky over Pohang. There was tension at the construction site of the Pohang steel mill, where there was no proper place to land. It was a time when it was impossible to imagine anyone visiting, as there was only a temporary road in the desolate field. Unexpectedly, President Park Chung-hee visited. President Park Chung-hee, who arrived early in the morning, had a complicated expression. President Park silently went to the site office. It was the best place to see the construction site. A year before President Park's visit, Pohang was a quiet fishing village with a population of 50,000. It was a place with painful memories of war, as it was also a battleground during the Korean War. The change in Pohang began on July 7, 1967, when President Park officially announced that Pohang had been selected as the site for the integrated steelworks. When the local residents heard the confirmed news that the integrated steelworks had been established in Pohang, they were extremely happy. At that time, the selection of the integrated steelworks site was a matter of national interest. The process of selecting the site for the steelworks was conducted in 1967, the year of the 6th presidential election and the 7th general election. Each political party made the attraction of the integrated steelworks an election promise, and the residents of each candidate's site dreamed of a bright future. At a time when even a single job was precious, the attraction of a new industrial complex that was expected to develop the region was an exciting election promise. So even though there was no funding prepared, the fight began from the selection of the site. The site survey for the integrated steel mill was conducted, and the factory had to be built on the coast. In order for ships weighing at least 50,000 tons to enter, the water depth had to be 5 to 10 meters. The construction of the first integrated steel mill in Korea in a quiet seaside village meant a new era for Pohang. However, many concessions had to be made. Many residents who lived where the steel mill was to be built had to leave their ancestral lands. Among the lands subject to land expropriation was a convent. At the time, it was also a shelter for many war orphans. The convent decided to move, thinking that it would be helpful to future children. At that moment, when they thought all the labor pains for a new history were over, the Korean government received disappointing news. The introduction of a loan that they had been confident in had gone down the drain. It cost a lot of money and lacked the technology to carry out a large project like a steel mill in a developing or underdeveloped country. The United States opposed it from the beginning. This was because the United States had given loans to Turkey and Brazil, but they never received them. What were President Park's feelings at the time? The construction of the integrated steel mill was a long-awaited project of the government at the time. Even existing steel mills were only capable of melting scrap iron, and in order to revive the poor Korean economy, the development of related industries through self-sufficiency in steel products was essential. However, the construction of the integrated steel mill, which was pushed forward recklessly, left behind a huge task of approximately 8.2 million square meters of wasteland. The construction of the integrated steel mill was pushed forward without even securing the funds. Why did the government at the time try to push forward with such a reckless project? The Eiffel Tower, built in France for the 1889 International Exposition, was a kind of showpiece structure built by France to show off its steel industry. At the time, the European steel industry was a product of the Second Industrial Revolution. As a large-scale reorganization of industries centered on the steel industry was carried out, the ranking of the major powers changed depending on which country took the lead in the steel industry. Since various heavy industries can develop depending on iron production, especially because it can provide international competitiveness, every country has tried to do steel production at least once. European countries, the United States, Japan, and many other advanced countries have grown as main industries in the steel industry since before World War II. However, at that time, we only had small blacksmith shops. It is not that we did not have any steel mills after the Korean War. However, they were very small and were only used to melt scrap iron. We could not even dream of having a comprehensive steel mill. The construction of an integrated steel mill requires large capital, technology, and skilled manpower. Economies of scale also come into play. A certain level of steel demand is required. However, there were not many new countries that could meet such conditions. That is why most countries tried but failed. On September 28th, President Park confirmed the construction of an integrated steel mill as a key project of the first five-year economic development plan. At that time, South Korea's iron production was about one-fifth of North Korea's, and the construction of an integrated steel mill was essential for South Korea's self-reliant economy and independent national defense. Industry must support South Korea's independent national defense. In order for industry to support it, iron products must be competitive. In order for South Korea to develop the power to prevent North Korea's invasion, iron production was essential. At that time, the government planned to build an iron mill with an annual production capacity of 220,000 tons in the Ulsan Industrial Complex. The start was smooth. The U.S. economic delegation led by General James Benfleet to Korea responded positively and even signed a preliminary contract. However, there was no further progress. The results of the investigation showed that it was not economically feasible. Since Japan is next door, even if we were to manufacture it in Korea, it would not be competitive. They said that it would be better to buy steel from Japan and other countries. The hope for the construction of a General Steel mill appeared in 1965 when President Park visited the U.S. at the invitation of President Johnson. Although the visit was mainly to discuss additional dispatch of troops to Vietnam, President Park Chung-hee was not only interested in that. During President Park's visit to the U.S. in 1965, he visited Pittsburgh, the largest steel city in the U.S. And there, President Park met an important person. He met Chairman Paul. At that time, President Park asked Chairman Paul to cooperate in the loan for the General Steel mill. President Park asked the company president to help him receive a loan from the U.S. The following year after President Park's visit to the U.S., the Korea International Steel Loan Corps was formed with the participation of 4 countries, including the U.S., to build a Korean integrated steel mill. In 1966, when the Korea International Steel Loan Corps was formed, the first five-year economic development plan began to produce visible results. The economic growth rate was expected to exceed 10%, and exports were expected to reach $300 million just 3 years after exceeding $100 million. It was a time when confidence and hope were high that we could do it too. However, in the steel sector, which was absolutely necessary for fostering export industries, domestic consumption exceeded 500,000 tons, while production was only 200,000 tons. It was an urgent time to build a modern steel mill. The loan required for the integrated steel mill was at least $100 million. Although it was a huge amount of money at the time, KISA responded positively. Foreigners came to Korea with interest to invest in our country, provide technology, and cooperate economically. Although there were about 5 years left until the end of the contract with Kisawa in September 1972, when construction was completed, it was not enough time to build a comprehensive steel mill with an annual production capacity of 1 million tons. President Park Chung-hee thought of President Park Tae-jun as the right person to lead the comprehensive steel mill. President Park Chung-hee called Park Tae-jun, who was on a business trip to England, and gave him the important task of building the comprehensive steel mill. The following year, in April 1968, Pahang Iron and Steel Company was founded. The 34 founding members had excellent skills in manufacturing, sales, and accounting, but had little knowledge of the steel mill. In fact, none of the founding members had seen the steel mill facilities with their own eyes. The only person who actually saw it was Chairman Park Tae-jun, who went to Japan to see the facilities himself, but no one else had properly seen the blast furnace. The founding members had never even seen a blast furnace. The people who had never seen a blast furnace built the comprehensive steel mill. President Park Chung-hee's trust in Park Tae-jun began long ago. To Park Chung-hee, who was an instructor at the Korea Military Academy, Park Tae-jun was a disciplined and spirited junior. When Chairman Park Tae-jun served as President Park Chung-hee's advisor while he was in the military, he had considerable trust in him. In the spring of 1968, when Posco was established, full-scale construction began. Construction was carried out simultaneously to dig up land to create an artificial harbor and fill in the wetlands with the dirt from the area. There were jokes about building an airfield because the area was so large, but it was a time filled with hope for the creation of the first integrated steel mill. The plains, devoid of human traces, were reminiscent of a desert. When the wind was strong, you couldn't even walk without safety glasses. Even with safety glasses, sand and dust would seep in, so it was said that the Pohang Eye Hospital was thriving thanks to the steel mill. Throughout the history of Posco, the only resting place for workers was a shabby two-story construction office. The memory of the break room where I would sleep, wrapped in a blanket after wandering through the sandy plains and tamping the dirt, still remains 45 years later. The belief that if you challenge yourself, you will achieve results. With that belief alone, I overcame each difficult day. At that time, Yongbei was literally a battlefield. I had to settle for accommodations in a cramped construction office, and when a sandstorm blew, I crawled inside a dredge pipe to eat. Also, since there was not a single breakwater in the area where the waves were strong, it was common to evacuate in a hurry. One day, while I was laying the groundwork with the sole pride of building the first integrated steel mill in Korea, I heard shocking news. It was the news that Kisa's loan plan had fallen through. The World Bank, which reviewed the Korean government's loan request at the request of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, questioned the economic feasibility of the Korean integrated steel mill. The introduction of the loan, which would account for most of the construction funds, became uncertain. As the introduction of the loan became difficult, public opinion opposed it. Park Tae-jun, who decided to resolve the issue himself, went to Pittsburgh, USA. He met with Kisa representatives and earnestly requested their cooperation in the loan, but the situation was already over. Why was the United States negative about Korea building an integrated steel mill? The United States concluded that Korea should not enter the steel industry, and Chairman Park Tae-jun received this notice and stopped by Hawaii on his way back to Korea. While stopping by Hawaii, Park Tae-jun had an idea after seeing Japanese people living in Hawaii. There was a fund for claims against Japan that could be brought in, and he thought it would be good to utilize this. The funds for claims against Japan that Korea and Japan had been dragging on for 14 years were a kind of compensation for Japanese colonial rule. It had been agreed between Korea and Japan that the funds for claims against Japan would be used for Korea's agriculture, forestry, and fisheries sectors. It took about a year of growing pains to sign the contract, but the Korean government persuaded Japan, citing security issues between the two countries, to secure funds as well as a promise of commercial loans and technological cooperation. If Korea produced steel and developed heavy industry through Japan's technology, Japan could also benefit. And the following year, they finally held a historic groundbreaking ceremony for the integrated steel mill. The moment the blast switch was finally pressed was a scene that symbolized the leap forward of the Republic of Korea. As the heart-wrenching loan issue was resolved, the atmosphere at the construction site also changed drastically. Now that the site construction had been completed, full-scale steel mill construction began. It was a groundbreaking ceremony that they had eagerly awaited, but the employees' hearts were heavy. Although they had secured funds, the amount was not enough to complete the steel mill. From this point on, they challenged the myth of shortening the construction period by completing the construction in the shortest period with the minimum number of people. In the process, the current Posco spirit that has grown into a global company was born. An integrated steel mill is not a common facility. That is why when you visit the Pohang Integrated Steel Mill, you are amazed by its scale. It was the same back then. A huge steel complex consisting of 22 large buildings was built on an endless wasteland. Some of the buildings were 30 stories high and some were 1 kilometer long. It was the largest construction project in Korean history. An integrated steel mill was built on 7,600 hectares of land. Just think about it. Each factory was large enough to be a company, but it was difficult to start them all at once. How did they make it possible to do such a huge and detailed work at the lowest cost? At that time, Pohang Iron and Steel chose the so-called backward construction method.